think it is fair to say that the national scene in general, and the federal government in particular, are the focus of most political and citizen efforts today. Liberals still call for massive federal government infusions, of inflated generated dollars to solve every conceivable problem. Even conservative and libertarian critics increasingly fall into the trap of focusing almost exclusively on the national scene, both as a source of our problems and as a place to make a difference. It is time to question that assumption and to prove that it is wrong. Some of you may recognize that as the words of entrepreneur and philanthropist William E. Simon from his foreword to Cutting Back City Hall, Bob Poole's seminal examination of the problem of local government overreach and exposition of solutions. Published in 1980, many of its descriptions read as though they were written yesterday. After explaining that from 1967 through 1976, city government revenues nationwide increased 187%, Bob notes that the city's era of free spending is over. This has been made even clearer by the spectacle of two of our major cities, New York and Cleveland, both reaching a condition of bankruptcy. Successive administrations of both cities thought they could spend their way out of trouble, only to discover the era of limits in an especially painful way. Does that sound familiar? Well, since 2010, several cities have applied for bankruptcy protection, including San Bernardino and Stockton in California and Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. But in 1980, the era of free spending really was over, at least temporarily. Citizens had already unleashed a barrage of ballot initiatives designed to cut taxes. These began, as so many experiments in government begin, in California, with Proposition 13, which limited property taxes to 1% of the assessed value and limited increases of that tax to 2% per year. The following year, 21 other states cut property taxes, in a revolution that has been viewed by some as presaging Reagan's. In the context of such tax cuts, Bob's book provided very practical advice, which in many cases drew on diverse existing practices as to how to cut local spending. Bob put these into three categories: privatization, user charges, and thinking smarter, a catch-all term relating to better management. The book contains chapters on pretty much every local government function: police, criminal justice, fire protection, emergency ambulance service, garbage and solid waste, leisure and recreational services, transit systems, social services and healthcare, planning and zoning, public works, city management, and schools. In the intervening years, most of Bob's advice has been adopted in one place or another, both domestically and internationally. Today, we're going to talk about a few examples of the application of these ideas, describing reasons, past, current, and future role. We will begin our work with our work on enhancing personal mobility. Over to Adrian.
Thanks, Julian. So Julian and I have worked out a set of stories we're going to tell. And the first is Atlanta, and Atlanta transportation in particular. Almost 6 years ago now, a fellow named Bob Galvin, who's the former CEO of Motorola, came to Reason and said, I've spent a lot of time thinking about congestion in our cities because I build factories and I hire people by the thousands, and I see the effects of congestion on my business, and when I extrapolate that to the economy, I realize that we have a huge problem that nobody really is recognizing, and it needs to be solved. And he wanted to help Reason to come up with solutions, and so we dove into that and partnered with a lot of smart transportation people outside of Reason as well as our own team, and developed ideas and solutions for how major metropolitan areas in the United States could build out a transportation system over a couple of decades that would actually reduce congestion. Because every single major metropolitan area in the United States right now has a long-range transportation plan that's required by the federal government in order to get federal money. And every single one of them predicts spending billions of dollars over 25 years and for congestion to get worse. And a lot of you have heard my outrage on that before. It was just amazing that we actually have a plan for things to spend money and for things to get worse. And why don't we have a plan for how to spend money and things actually get better? Well, to make the ideas that we developed more concrete, we've decided to build out actual detailed plans for a number of cities. And the first one we did was Atlanta. And we proposed a network of hot lanes on all of the major freeways in the Atlanta area, a major new tunnel freeway paralleling the most congested north-south freeway through the downtown area, completing some missing links in sort of the network around the city, including another major tunnel project. So a set of projects that, if they were built and if they were tolled with congestion pricing as a choice, so all the free roads would still exist, but we would add on to that a whole bunch of tolled roads, you would create more choices for people, and you would dramatically reduce congestion, especially relative to the current plan. And so Atlanta was our first. We went on to some other cities. In Atlanta in particular, we rolled out this study right at a time when the city was rolling out their long-range update to their long-range plan, which was all about building a bunch of interesting new commuter rail transit lines and so forth. And their plan was very explicitly to spend 50% of the money on about 5% of the travelers, and therefore to spend about 50% of the money on 95% of the travelers. And we pointed out, well, that might not be sustainable, and that maybe what you want to do is actually spend the money, you know, somewhat relative to the way people actually travel, and thereby improve travel for most people, rather than say, you know what, we're going to doom 95% of the people to an ever-worsening transportation situation, and 5% of the people will get a little bit better deal. We were lucky there. In every city where we do this, we look for someone, a local leader, to really pick up the standard. And the fellow who was then the chairman of the State Transportation Commission, a fellow named Vance Smith, loved our plan, really championed it. And in fairly short order, within a couple of years, we had the two most important elements of our plan incorporated into the official government plan. And that was the hot networks, the hot lane networks, and one of the tunnel projects. And the two most interesting things to say about that is, one, the first segment of the new hot lanes opened last year. So what we proposed 4 years ago is now the first element has been built and is opened. So we're very, very excited about that. It's been successful in its first 4 months, 5 months now, maybe 4 months? 13 months. Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'm confusing the Miami lanes, I guess. So it's been successful. It had some real birthing pains. That was very interesting. We're bucking a governor who is, you know, he's one of those interesting and all too often seen, you know, Republicans who loves markets except for the markets he doesn't like, and he doesn't see how the private sector can do anything good in transportation, apparently. So we're bucking up against that. But the first elements of the plan are in place. They're successful. I think they're starting to convince people. We had an interesting breakthrough on the tunnels we proposed, because the first reaction whenever we talk about building tunnels is, well, it's too expensive, we can't do that. You know, the fact that we've been crunching the numbers and looking at the costs and benefits and adding up how you could pay for these tunnels takes a while to soak in. But in Atlanta's case, what was great was there was actually a project in the city going on at the time we proposed this to build a gigantic new sewer tunnel. And so we arranged with some local groups for a bunch of the transportation folks to go on a tour of that sewer tunnel. Now, this is an 18-foot sewer tunnel, so more than big enough to drive cars through. And when they saw that this tunnel was being built without anybody even really knowing about it, it was just, well, yeah, you can't do sewers without big tunnels, duh. They were like, oh, well, maybe building a tunnel isn't so crazy after all. So it was that visual for them was so much more compelling than all the numbers we could throw at them. So Atlanta has been a success in terms of adopting the things we proposed. Politically, it remains challenging. Last year, they had a ballot proposition to raise sales taxes in the city, in the state, and fund, again, the old plan. So they wanted to raise a lot of money to fund a bunch of rail transit projects. And we were very active. One of our staff, Baruch Feigenbaum, is actually located in Atlanta, and he worked with the state-based free market think tank there and really took on that tax increase, and the voters voted it down, which was a great victory. And now it's back to considering what to do going forward, and our plan is front and center again. Baruch and the state-based think tank are actually releasing an update to our now almost 5-year-old plan, so updating it with all the new numbers and the new stories. And so we're just pushing to get what really is a 25-year vision for improved transportation in Atlanta implemented there. And so needless to say, we're only 5 years into that process. We've done the same thing in Miami, and Miami is probably our second most successful place. Most of you know Bob is in the Miami area. We have a Miami plan, and Bob is having great success at getting the powers that be there to start adopting pieces of our plan. We've released a plan in the Fort Myers, Florida area where they're also have incorporated into their plan some of the things we proposed. And we just released this last year Chicago's plan. They haven't adopted any of it yet, but I was actually just last week at a Northwestern University conference with all of the transportation planners for the Chicago area, and we had some very productive discussions, and they were a lot less skeptical now than they were last August. So in just 6 months, we've made progress. We're coming out soon with plans for Los Angeles and Denver in the next year and a half as well, and we're going to keep pushing in Atlanta and other places. So that process of developing the ideas and then working with the policymakers to hash out the details and get pieces of the plan implemented is fundamental to that project.
Thank you, Adrian. I want now to talk about trash. In Cunning Back City Hall, Bob Poole described 4 ways in which trash could be collected. By the city itself, that's municipal collection, public collection. By a single firm hired by the city, that's contract collection. By several private firms that had exclusive locations where they could pick up trash but would charge each resident privately. And by competing private firms with no government involvement except possibly licensing, and that's pure private collection. And he asked the question, well, which of these is best? Well, first of all, he offered an anecdote. In 1979, New York City's twice-weekly unionized municipal-run trash collections cost each resident $297 per year. That's real money back in 1979. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in Belrose, Queens, a private contractor was providing thrice-weekly, 3 times a week collection for $72 a year. The anecdote speaks for itself. But Bob then cites evidence that contract and franchise operations were the least costly for cities of all size. But for cities over 50,000 people, the difference was enormous, with municipal collection costing 68% more on average than a contract firm. In later work for Reason, Lynn Scarlett explains why this is. Compared with municipal trash collectors, private contractors require more work from employees, offer equivalent salaries but fewer benefits, match skill levels with job requirements, use part-time labor when appropriate, require that managers be responsible for equipment and labor availability, allow first-line supervisors to have hiring and firing authority, use incentive pay systems, and use less labor-intensive means of providing a given service. The bottom line is incentives matter, and private companies have much stronger incentives to contain costs than public companies. Perhaps this explains why even in 1978, only about a quarter of municipalities surveyed used municipal collection. 43% had contract or franchise collection, and 30% had private collection. But ironically, many of the larger municipalities, including New York and Los Angeles, ran municipal collection, guaranteeing their residents poor and expensive service. As a result, some estimates put the total volume of trash under municipal collection at around 70% in those times. Following Bob's early work on this, Reason undertook a slew of studies analyzing the costs of private versus public collection, as well as publishing how-to guides for public officials explaining how to cut costs through privatization. And it worked, at least in part. In the years since, the volume of trash collected privately has steadily risen. While precise numbers remain elusive, the ratio of municipal to private collection by volume has more or less reversed, with 70% being collected privately and only 30% publicly. Even Morris County, New Jersey, where I now live, has been gradually privatizing its waste management town by town. Sadly, New York and LA still operate municipal collection. But at least LA introduced user fees, one of the ideas that Bob advocated, which cover the costs of trash collection and disposal. Since 2008, the annual cost for a single-family home in LA has been $435.84, while households in multiple dwellings pay $291.96. By contrast, in 2012, each household in New York City paid about $700 for its trash to be collected out of general taxes. So in the more dense urban population, you're charging considerably more because of the municipal non-user fee-based system. But another phenomenon has occurred in the past 30 years, an obsession with recycling. This had already begun in 1979 when Bob was writing Cutting Back City Hall. He describes increasing concerns about landfill running out and the need to find alternative disposal options. Being a rational engineer, Bob talked about burning trash, which in many cases does make sense, since heat recovery enables energy to be generated that partly offsets the costs of separating waste post-consumer. Other technologies developed by private entrepreneurs mean that post-consumer separation now, combined with recycling and burning, often have a lower cost alternative to landfill. But to many environmentalists, recycling is something that must be done by the consumer. That means separating waste at source and having a separate collection. Never mind the fact that such trash usually has to be sorted later anyway, because people are imperfect. They don't sort accurately, and there's a need to differentiate subsequently. That's because, but the reason why environmentalists believe that is because they think that recycling is a moral issue, not an economic one. And their objective is, ultimately, to reduce consumption. Hence their mantra, reduce, reuse, recycle. Lynn Scarlett's work for Reason in the 90s sought to combat this demented mantra. In particular, she challenged the idea that producers of packaged goods should be forced to establish separate collection and recycling programs for their packaging. This idea, called extended producer responsibility, took hold in Germany in the early 90s and spread throughout Europe. Fortunately, Lynn was very successful. Most attempts to implement extended producer responsibility for packaging in the United States floundered against her barrage of logic. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for municipal curbside recycling programs, which, as your show of hands indicated, have flourished in spite of their lack of economic or ecological logic. Worse, extended producer responsibility is now beginning to rear its head again, and it is happening at the municipal level. Reason is addressing this problem in two ways. First, we're undertaking research to assess the impact of taxes and bans on bottled water, and we'll promote that research widely. Second, we are undertaking research to investigate ways in which municipalities can cut their waste management costs. Based on available evidence, we expect to find that competitive tendering for waste collection, combined in some cases at least with post-consumer sorting and recovery, will be the most cost-effective solution and might even increase total recycling rates. We'll then produce a how-to guide offering advice to municipalities about the best ways to cut costs, essentially what we did with Lynn in the 1990s. And we aim to engage directly with the municipalities promoting this guide, targeting especially those contemplating the implementation of an extended producer responsibility program. If I'm right, and we are successful, that second collection for recycling may become a thing of the past, and our local taxes and waste management fees will fall commensurately.
Thanks, Julian. So I'm going to shift to a broader privatization. Some of you have seen our video on Sandy Springs, Georgia, or heard Len talk at Reason Weekend in the past about Sandy Springs. So for those of you not familiar with Sandy Springs is a city, a relatively new city outside of Atlanta, a suburb of Atlanta, that was an unincorporated part of a county where the folks were very dissatisfied with the quality of services they got from the county government, and their agitation over the years had got them nowhere, and so they eventually incorporated themselves, created their own city, and the big innovation was they created this city with an almost entirely privatized government. Under state law, they had to have a government, police, and fire department, and everything else is privatized. They have 10 staff and those 10 staff are essentially just manage the contract with the private company that does everything except for police and fire, as well as you know, supports the city council. You still have an elected city council. Now, the way this happened is a combination of that unrest, the opportunity finally to incorporate, and this one guy, who was Oliver Porter, is at that point already retired, had worked in a lot of different city governments, lived in the area, liked this idea. At the beginning, he, like everybody else, was really focused on getting their own city so they could control their own destiny. And it was only once that process got started that he thought, well, you know, really, we could do this all with just a contract with private companies. We don't have to have a whole city government. And so he pushed that idea in this sort of volunteer process they had of creating this city. So it didn't take him very long once he started thinking like that and talking to others and getting, you know, some positive feedback. Well, maybe we should explore that. He looked around and came across Reason, saw what we had, contacted us. And I can remember flying out there for a day of meetings, and we were at a company's conference room, and the city they had not yet had the vote to incorporate. So there's no official city government. But literally, on 12:01 a.m. on a date certain, once that vote passes, they have to have a city government. They are legally not allowed to do any city business until 12:01 a.m. on that first day. But at 12:01 a.m. on that first day, they're supposed to have a functioning city government. So it was just like Joseph Heller. It was a catch-22. Ridiculous. And so what they had to do was they had to create a shadow government, essentially, that was all volunteer and unofficial, that could then just start on day one and then go through the process of making everything legal. So, but to keep it all clean, we sat there in this conference room and we would talk with some people, and then they would leave, and then the next group would come in, and then they would leave, and then the next group, because we couldn't get everybody together because they wanted to avoid potential conflicts of interest. So it was this very bizarre parade of people, you know, community leaders and business leaders coming in to talk about these privatization ideas. And through it all, it was me and my colleague at the time, Jeff Siegel, just tapping into the wealth of work that Reason had done since Bob wrote Cutting Back City Hall. After he wrote that book, Reason commenced saying, well, let's research every service area that state and local governments do, capture what is known about what works and doesn't work in government providing those services, find out where it's been privatized, how did that work, what's the best example, what can they teach us, what are the lessons learned, study after study after study on every service you can think of. You know, there's a ridiculous number of them, and they're all ridiculously detailed. But we had all that, and that was great because they had to write an RFP that talked about how you move the paper products, the documents of the city from point A to point B, all the way up to how you pave the streets, and everything in between. Every little minute detail that goes into a city government had to be covered in these contracts. And it was our stuff that broke down, well, here's how these cities did it and what they covered. And we were able to bring in people from cities, you know, when they said, well, now we're writing the part on trash collection, or now we're writing the part on you know, heating maintenance in the city buildings, or whatever it might be. They didn't have too many city buildings, so that was easy. But trimming trees around the telephone lines, you know, whatever it might be, we could go out and say, okay, well, who's, you know, according to, we keep tabs on all of these privatizations, you know, who's the cutting edge out there? Can we arrange a phone conference so they can tell them how they tackled all of these problems? And so months of this process of sharing all of this information we accumulated over a decade and a half, 2 decades, and letting all that feed into this, you know, telephone book-sized contract they ultimately had. But at the end of that process, they had a government with, you know, outside of police and fire, only 10 city employees. And Oliver became the first city manager, and is still involved very much. And he likes to point out, he says, you know, all these cities going bankrupt over pension problems, and we don't have any pensions because we only have pension problems. We only have 10 employees. So they've avoided all of those fiscal problems that have plagued so many cities. There's, in almost every dimension you could ask, their services have improved. I mean, that's really what motivated that kind of the average man on the street who had no ideological care for this privatization stuff. They did have to vote on it, and it did pass a vote, but I think the average person really was more concerned about, are we finally going to get decently paved streets and trash collected on time and ambulances that get here in 5 minutes instead of 25 minutes and things like that. That's what they really cared about, and they got that. They got vastly improved services. I do think it's there's a little bit of a lesson embedded in this for libertarians, and especially libertarians who feel heart pangs for democracy, that watching this city be created in this sort of privatized model and have an elected city council, a city council that doesn't have very much managing to do because the private company's taking care of everything. All they have is a contract, and they have to make sure that they're managing that contract, but that's relatively no work for the city council. So what's a poor city council to do? They got to meet a couple times a month. They got to do something, right? Because you can't just go have a meeting and not do something. So unfortunately, at least I don't live there, but my outside perspective is they've been all too susceptible to the idea, well, if there's a problem, let's regulate it. And so a bit of nothing else to do but pass regulations, so that's all they do is pass regulations. And it's not ridiculous, and it's not, it's not the most regulated town around, but I just watch that process and I say, if you've got a democratically elected government, they are going to do things. And if it's not spend money, which they can't really spend much money, then they'll do other things. And that's just the nature, unless you constrain. If they had written a city charter that said, well, we're going to have a city council, but sort of like the Bill of Rights, we're going to say they can only do these things. If they had been constrained in the charter, they might have wound up being more successful in that regard. So it's food for thought, especially since the main takeaway from all that for Reason was, one, the yeoman work we put in over the years after cutting back City Hall of digging into every municipal service and knowing how they could all be privatized really paid off in one bundle in this particular case, which just goes to show that everywhere else where they're trying to privatize just one of those things, we've had the stuff that they need. But that this model both has inspired a number of other communities, and there's now half a dozen other towns in Georgia and other states that have essentially replicated that model to some scale. So they've incorporated themselves as a largely privatized city. But when I'm talking to, any other town in America, and they're saying, well, gee, we're not sure we can privatize our street maintenance, And I'm like, if you look at Sandy Springs, they privatized everything. Really? If they can privatize everything, you telling me they're so much more competent down in Georgia than you are here in Utah that you can't privatize just street maintenance? Can we go on the radio and talk about that? I want you to confess to people, no, those Georgians are way smarter than us. But no, it's a beacon in a sense that if they can do it this large, that the idea that you can't privatize on some more modest scale looks pretty silly. So it's both a model for privatized cities and just a model for privatization, and validates sort of our approach of having the best examples and the contacts with the people who've been there, done that, to take to every new city that looks at privatization.
Thanks. Actually, a side note, Adrian, I talked to Oliver Porter about the reasons why they didn't privatize fire and police. But that's something, again, that Bob talks about in Privatizing City Hall, and which we have done some work on at Reason. And he said that the reason was the cost of insurance, and that if they had privatized, they would have been subject to, potentially, to tortious liability at an unlimited scale, which would have meant that they would have had to have taken out very, very expensive insurance on their police and fire. But when it's provided by the government, the police and fire have indemnity. Right. So it's kind of a sort of sad indictment, actually. So it's not the state legislation per se, but more the tort system that's the problem. I'm going to talk now quickly about education, an issue that Reason's been involved with very intensively in the past few years. In Cutting Back City Hall, Bob describes the parlous state and high cost of education in the late 1970s. He notes that between 1950 and 1976, real per pupil expenditure on education had risen nearly threefold. Meanwhile, rates of functional illiteracy had risen from 11% to 16%. Incredible. So you triple the amount you're spending on education and literacy rates decline. Moreover, between 1964 and 1975, scores on SATs had also fallen, with the proportion of students achieving over 600 on the verbal SAT falling 36%, and the proportion scoring over 700 falling 48%. Pumping more money into education is not necessarily the solution. The problem with our education system is essentially one of a lack of competition. With over 80% of schools being run directly by government and with pay and other employment conditions being set by negotiation with unions, there is no real mechanism to incentivize good teaching. Don't get me wrong, there are thousands of well-meaning teachers in the state sector. There are even many good teachers. The problem is that the current system doesn't provide appropriate rewards for good teaching. Quite the opposite. It rewards mediocrity and years in service, while making it extremely difficult to punish incompetence. And it makes it easy for teachers to retire early. So, what we get is mediocrity, along with a vast and increasing pension obligation. Bob discussed several ways in which choice in education might be increased, including education vouchers. Such vouchers have actually existed since the late 19th century, but have generally been used only very narrowly, for example, in locations where population densities were too low to support a public school. A modern version of the voucher was developed by Milton Friedman in the 1950s, and this sought to apply the idea more generally. Tax dollars currently used for public schools would be given instead to parents as vouchers to be used to pay for private schools. Since schools would be able to keep any profit, they would have incentives to innovate, driving up quality and driving down costs, hiring good teachers, firing bad ones. Better schools would thrive, worse schools would go bust or would be taken over. Several states, including Wisconsin, Indiana, and Louisiana, have adopted voucher programs. Others have adopted related measures, such as tax credits in Florida and education savings accounts in Arizona. But none of these programs are universal. Most of them target lower income or poorly performing school districts. Moreover, in many states, vouchers have, perhaps unsurprisingly, been blocked by teacher unions. In the 90s, Reason's Lisa Snell helped develop another way to introduce competition in education that was less directly amenable to attack by teachers' unions because it seeks to work within the general structure of state-financed education. Called portability or backpack funding, the idea is to give parents the choice over which public school their kids attend and then allocate funding in proportion to the number of students enrolled so that the money follows the child. For backpack funding to work, however, public schools must be able to set their own budgets and not be bound by all the usual strictures on hiring, firing, and compensating teachers. In other words, they need to be structured as charter schools. In Louisiana, a 95 law allowed charter schools, but was so restrictive that little choice emerged. Continual abysmal failure of the school system prompted a change in the law in 2003 that made it much easier to create charter schools and empowered the state's Board of Education to use charters to replace failing schools. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated Louisiana's school system. More than 100 public schools were closed, displacing approximately 118,000 school-aged children throughout the state. The state stepped in to reopen schools, encouraging school choice by facilitating charters, including by adopting Reason's idea of workplace charter schools, whereby corporations sponsor schools in exchange for enrollment preferences for employees' children. Today, in New Orleans, nearly 60% of the city's estimated 26,000 students are in charter schools, and test scores have risen dramatically since 2005. In 2008, Lisa met with Governor Bobby Jindal and his Superintendent of Education to talk about how to expand school choice and competition further through backpack funding. She testified before the state's Commission on Streamlining Government on Backpack Funding, and the Commission passed an immediate resolution directing the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education to pursue her recommendations. Lisa then worked with the State Board on implementing backpack funding, including tiger teams of school finance experts for 3 symposia designed to help school administrators and state policymakers understand the model. In February 2011, Governor Jindal announced a pilot project on backpack funding involving 7 school districts. Lisa is now working closely with those districts and the state to help with implementation. In the largest such district, Jefferson Parish, she is helping with a district-wide implementation that will eventually cover all 50,000 students. Already, Jefferson Parish has eliminated 259 central office positions and redirected $5 million back to the schools. In addition to Louisiana, Lisa has helped Nevada devise a pilot portability program and has teamed up with state-based think tanks in Washington, Pennsylvania, and Virginia to publish studies on how they could follow suit. Lisa is building on these successes, developing a fully fledged education center within reason, with the aim of encouraging more municipalities and states to follow Louisiana's lead. The center will develop various materials, including case studies and how-to guides, which will be distributed in collaboration with state think tanks around the country. Lisa and others will then follow up with more concrete advice to policymakers, no doubt more tiger teams. In the medium term, we foresee a tipping point where school choice becomes mainstream, leading many municipalities and states to adopt charters and portability. Looking further down the line, as the trend continues, private solutions will begin to dominate, first with education vouchers and ESAs, and eventually with pure private provision, our vision for education. But for now, we must focus on advocating the incremental changes that are possible and identifying and working with motivated policymakers to implement them. By increasing choice in education, we will extend freedom and opportunity to our children and cut tax dollars.
All right, well, the sort of last of our little vignettes here has to do with circling back to California. You know, there was a time when Julian talked at the beginning about Prop 13 in California as there was a time when California was a source of good policy ideas, like limiting taxes. Unfortunately, California followed not too long after that with starting down the path of becoming the pioneer of bad ideas, by far not the least being the unionization of government workers. One of the unfortunate consequences that little innovation wrought is an explosion over a decade and a half of hidden costs to state and local governments in the form of pension and health benefits for state workers. A decade ago, just looking at local numbers, I could see for this largest city near me, which is Bakersfield, California, a modest-sized city, I could see that in 2020, which is now a lot closer than it was when I crunched those numbers, that in 2020, the city's fire department would be paying more to non-working firemen than they would be paying to working firemen, because their annual pension costs would be greater than their annual salary costs. By 2020, I mean, it's a ridiculously unsustainable system. In 2006, looking more broadly, Reason published a study called The Gathering Pension Storm, where we looked at the trends all over the United States and said, this is all a bunch of hidden costs that's not only hidden in the way it's budgeted for because it's future costs, but it's hidden actuarially by reports that are published by state and local governments that just say, well, don't worry, we're going to make so much money in the stock market that we'll be fine, essentially. That's because we're going to make double the average market returns for the next 25 years. Trust us. So our report pointed out, well, no, this is not likely to happen, and in fact, we're going to face we have real liabilities of maybe as much as $2 trillion at that time. And the reaction we got, I mean, just even within sort of the economists and relatively more free market folks, there was a lot of skepticism that those numbers could possibly be that bad. And of course, it took about a year and a half of more people paying more attention to that to reveal that we had underestimated by a good 50% the actual extent of the problem. So the overhang is huge, and the reaction from those government employees unions was vigorous. That is, in all my years of working at Reason and going and speaking and advocating in front of, testifying in front of legislatures and city councils and speaking in front of them at conferences, you know, there's been a number of times when there were sort of minor tensions and conflicts with unions, but when this report came out and we went on the road talking about this report, I mean, they got mean. I had, you know, physical intimidation. I trying to speak to legislators, had them come up and stand around me while I'm sitting just like this in front of a group like this. They would actually march up here and line up in a big goon squad behind me and try to intimidate me into not talking. And poor Lisa Snell, they actually created a barrier. She was supposed to testify before a legislative hearing. They identified her in the crowd and formed a physical wall around her so she could not go up and give her testimony when she was called. She could not break through their wall of giant thuggish bodies. So she was back there saying, I'm here, but I can't get there, and the legislature didn't care. Because I think they knew which side their bread was buttered on. So it brought out the worst in these public employee unions because it exposed the sweet deal they had in secret. They certainly knew these numbers. California deserves a lot of the blame for that problem because it pioneered these terrible policies, and it has reaped the most severe consequences since. I mean, our incredible budget problems we have in California, you know, it's like, I like to brag when I'm meeting with people from lots of different states that our budget deficit is bigger than your entire budget. And that's true. More than half the state's entire budget is smaller than California's budget deficit. So it's a fine distinction. We followed up that first report in 2006 that described the problem with a report focused on California, since it was at the bleeding edge of this problem, on, well, what are some of the mechanisms that are being developed to solve this problem? How do you wind down the costs of these commitments? How do you stop making the problem worse? Because it is a tricky business. I mean, those of you who haven't heard me or one of my colleagues talk about this before, if you think about pensions, you know, they are contractual obligations in some form. And so to tell people who've been working for 10 years for the state of California, well, you know, you were supposed to get this pension, well, now you're not going to get that pension. That's hard to do, hard to fight in court. Though even in that dimension, some progress is made. But they can certainly pay more themselves into the pension system, and we can certainly quit offering those kind of gold-plated pensions to new employees. And there's lots of other reforms that can be done. Well, it wasn't long after that that cities in California and counties in California who really had severe fiscal problems started looking for ways to make reforms. And now about a dozen cities in California have passed some form of pension reform, with the biggest and boldest examples being San Diego and San Jose. Now in San Diego, those of you who saw the video last night, you saw Carl DeMaio as a city councilman, was until recently a city councilman in San Diego, and who led that effort. He used to work for Reason, and he understood these reform ideas very well, and he pushed them effectively through in San Diego. In San Jose, a group of reformers who ran for city council on the pension issue got into office, implemented essentially the very package of reforms that we proposed in our reform study. And then on a smaller scale, you had other cities just sort of rein things in. The city, Bakersfield, I mentioned, near where I live, a friend of mine who was on the city council led those efforts and shifted the benefits for all new employees back to rational levels, required all employees to start paying into the system along with the taxpayers so that both were contributing to the pension and not just the taxpayers. And so we're nibbling away at the problem. So California, you know, maybe that's the first step in. I had a couple of people essentially ask me the question last night is, you know, when as a nation, or in the context of California, when do we hit bottom? When do people finally wake up and start demanding that things change? And there's a feeling, I think, in California now that we're at that point or very near that point. We've got cities going bankrupt. We have Democrats leading pension reform in San Jose, as well as Republicans in San Diego and other cities. So it's, you know, there's a broadening realization that what we've been doing doesn't work, that we have to do things differently in California. That maybe that same kind of feeling that I can remember from before Prop 13, this dissatisfaction with the way things have been going, leading to some pretty big and revolutionary change. It seems like we're at a moment like that in California. And it's kind of cool because David mentioned last night that Carl, having very insanely narrowly lost his bid to be mayor of San Diego, still wants to do reform in California, is joining Reason and leading a California reform initiative that is a big, we have a 10-year vision for how we're going to, piece by piece, in the same way that we followed up cutting back City Hall by saying, how do we piece by piece build up the body of ideas for privatization that makes privatization, no matter where you are and what you might want to privatize, something that's relatively easy to do, at least in terms of the knowledge about what to do. How do we do that for California? How do we develop all of the reform ideas so that we have the whole package of reforms, we have the plan, and then how do we build the coalition, the sort of new majority of people in California who recognize that the change needs to happen and are willing to push for that? And then how do we educate, train the people in government to adopt these ideas and play that same role we played in Sandy Springs, in Louisiana, in Atlanta, not only developing ideas, but knowing where those ideas have been done, how they actually worked, and helping with the implementation, helping overcome the barriers, helping make the case to the constituents, make the case in the media, all of those things. I mean, that's what has always sort of set Reason's policy work apart, is that multifaceted, from the research all the way through not just to passing the law, but then once the law is passed, how do you actually do the new policies? Once you change your pensions, how do you actually create the new rules that don't just dig you back into the same problem once again? All that follow through is crucial. If we do that for California, if we can turn California around, not just fiscally, but just in terms of being a more liberty-minded state, being a less regulatory state, being a more business-friendly state, being a lower tax state, that could be the kind of transformation that actually answers the question of when do we as a nation bottom out. And if California turns around, maybe that sets the course or sets the example for the rest of the country, and this sort of where do I get mine for free attitude starts to turn to how do we create, you know, a land of opportunity again. So thank you very much.